So now that we've looked at environmental conditions and system features, let's also look at how the features that contribute to and how we can address basically person problems, like problems with people who won't do what they're supposed to, who aren't complying with the other systems that have been put in place. So person problems will typically can be described as an insufficient ability to detect and avoid errors. So this might be just not being able to do something, which typically with an appropriate knowledge and training, with enough sleep and rest, two sets of eyes, and double checking in some cases. You need to have sort of the cognitive ability and also the sort of automaticity of making decisions. Those can typically be addressed through the types of features we've talked about it before. What's a little bit different is something like an insufficient motivation or a desire to avoid mistakes, laziness in essence. Probably less of an issue that you might think, but not insufficient. You can end up with things like once people sort of start slacking off and you start getting a few anomalies, if they aren't sort of dealt with, then people might be like, oh, it's not a big deal to get an anomaly, and then things can sort of cascade from there. You get closer and closer to those low probability but high damage incidents. So usually then to deal with this insufficient motivation or a desire to avoid mistakes, you want to, and also just to avoid norm creep, if you will, you want to punish mistakes. And again, the two sets of eyes will help. In particular, often having people watch people so that people who are watched are more likely to abide by norms. What, of course, is difficult is how you can judge this under environmental uncertainty. So whenever you have incomplete knowledge of errors and anomalies, it's almost impossible to differentiate between a case where somebody was unable to detect or avoid an error and where they weren't motivated to do so. So that gets quite tricky in those cases. How then do we see these responses to person problems in these two cases? So in the ICS, there's clearly some shaming of people who go outside. So for example, people, emergency workers who go too far outside the boundaries of what's acceptable might be called things like freelancers. So there's basically some sort of internal monitoring of behaviors to make sure that people do what they're supposed to. And in this case, don't actually abuse the relative discretion that on-the-ground firefighters are given. There's a lot of mutual monitoring, so people who are working in close proximity to one another, in essence, have their eyes on one another and can tell when people make mistakes. That's also part of what gives them the ability to shame. And again, you've got multiple eyes even scanning environmental conditions, so there's sort of a way to know sort of what's right on a higher transparency of behavior to ensure that people know they're being watched and are more likely to abide by norms. Also, it's pretty nice. There tend to be these sort of after-action reviews, hot wash, follow-up type processes where you have individual and team follow-ups likely to be conducted within units once you get outside of the emergency situation. So there tends to be like a lessons learned again, or a hot wash or an after-action review to learn from this. Because again, whenever you're dealing with this pretty complex, moderately uncertain environment with unique situations, you often want to do lessons learned so that you can continue to accumulate knowledge on these unique situations. With the naval air, punishment can exist in low tempo situations in particular. And again, there's a heavy use of things like investigations following errors in which typically someone is held accountable. So again, this sort of after-action review investigations. And in higher tempo situations in particular, you tend to get a more incremental. So it's not like an investigation where somebody's going to be held wrong. Instead, it's like, how can we do this a little bit better? Basically acknowledging the difference in, you shouldn't really be making mistakes in low tempo situations, but high tempo and particularly emergency situations can get so cognitively stressful that it's not exactly any person problem so much as we need to take steps to make sure all the people actually are prepared, maybe even update our manuals, etc. And again, we tend to get a lot of mutual monitoring and multiple eyes. In essence, the sort of multiple eyes idea is that if you, for example, in an experimental setting, if you tell someone not to cheat on a test and that you actually put a literal pair of eyes on the computer, you can actually do things like reduce cheating, increase civic mindedness. And that's particularly true when people are observing your behavior, because there's people in essence then have a possibility to get punished. There's sort of rational choice explanation. but it's sufficient to say that simply having your behavior be observed, greater transparency will tend to increase norm compliance. So this is sort of a summary then of these different methods of control and coordination that we can think about in terms of operational rules, decision norms, worker discretion, specialization, training goals. This is basically a nice summary that goes across all the things we've talked about in this lecture that you can think about as the way we might think about how we could summarize the different features in this case and how it is that each of these features that correspond to things like operational rules, either surveillance, worker discretion, etc., correspond to different environmental conditions, situational or sort of system level type conditions, or person problem responses. And though I've tried to give the logic throughout this lecture series, I just want to repeat here that when we go in and we want to do explanation in general with that sort of follows the style of this course, we want to think about things like there's some sort of a feature that we might be interested in, say like extensive simulation training. And in essence, this means that most decisions end up automatic. So this is sort of the mechanism, if you will, that it sort of works through, that people can easily make decisions. In essence, it's going to then reduce their cognitive load of having to make decisions under high tempo or high stress conditions, and they can increase their attention and ability to recognize anomalies. So basically by freeing up some of the cognitive load, you can increase. So the idea again is that you have a feature, there's a underlying sort of theoretical mechanism at work, and that then leads to an outcome. And that's the type of logic I'd like to see when you write about these things in short answers or final exams. The same with, you can look here at clear delineation of responsibility. Basically means in some cases, right, that you have sort of seamless transitions through who does what. So you know exactly who's supposed to be doing what, and then airplanes are like less likely to get lost in the shuffle, or airplanes are less likely to get moved around on the airplane carriers, or people are less likely to, they don't forget people who are being rescued. So all of these things basically lead to a reduction of basically gray space and a reduced probability of errors. The same, well, this is an example, any type of public shared space, like on the ship, or to some extent, like the disasters, you're basically going to get higher experience of surveillance of multiple eyes, and so you tend to have increased attentiveness and motivation and ability to control, also an ability to correct mistakes, so a robustness outcome. So again, this doesn't go over everything, but hopefully with what I've said in other cases, you get some idea of these different ways that we might think about explanation.